Welcome, everyone. When I first came here to Toronto a couple of years ago, I was told there's a Toronto time. It starts 10 minutes later. We didn't plan this, but this is when we're starting. So thank you for bearing with us. And all those of you who are online, we had a little bit of technical difficulty, but we're back here. And thank you for joining us both in person and online. Before we begin, I wish to acknowledge this land on which University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been traditional land of Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we're grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. Welcome to Mapping Prejudice. Let me start by talking about our star speaker, Michael Corey. He will do about a 45-minute presentation, then I will do a small presentation, after which we'll do a Q&A session, as well as transcribing some actual racial covenants. Michael Corey is the Geospatial Technical and Data Lead Associate Director of Mapping Prejudice. Michael's primary role is to design, build, and maintain the deed machine, that's the sales deed machine, Mapping Prejudice technical platform for identifying and mapping racial covenants, as well as to work with community partners and public records custodians to facilitate more racial covenants research. Michael is also a master's student in the University of Minnesota's Heritage Studies, as well as the Public History program. Before transitioning to public history, Michael spent 20 years as a journalist and data journalist at the Star Tribune, revealed from the Center for Investigative Reporting and the Des Moines Register. His journalism work spanned zoning and segregation, mortgage disparities, the U.S. Mexico border fence system, human-induced earthquakes, and sexual abuse in the Catholic Church. Well, join me in welcoming Michael.
Thank you, everyone, for being here today and for your patience. I'm going to check one thing real quick and make sure that I can control this. Make sure that we are not muted. Can people on Zoom hear us? Okay, good. Okay, thank you. Great. So thank you, Dr. Sood, for that introduction. And again, I'm really happy to be in Toronto, and I'm especially happy to be here with Dr. Sood, who has been a long time advocate for our work at Mapping Prejudice and has also really played a key role in teaching us what is the point of mapping racial covenants. And so we're going to talk about that today. And she's going to talk a lot more about that, but I just want to emphasize how indebted we are to the work of Dr. Sood, and we're really thankful to be here today. So I work for Mapping Prejudice. Mapping Prejudice was started in 2016 by a group of activist researchers at the University of Minnesota libraries who wanted to make the first comprehensive map of racial covenants for an American city. And before I start, I want to give a warning that I think is potentially not surprising. I'm going to get rid of that. But I do want to make sure I say that we're talking about racial covenants. We're going to see some language that includes some outdated terms and some racist terms. And I just want everyone to know that. And I also want to say, if anyone needs to step out or needs a minute, that's totally fine. Feel free to do so. Do what you have to do to take care of yourself. But we are going to talk about this language and why it's important today. So. Advance. There we go. So how many people have seen a racial covenant before? Just show of hands. Okay. This is really interesting for us because when Mapping Prejudice started and we asked that question, I think we got a pretty similar response that we just saw now. Is a few people, but not that many, had actually seen an example of a racial covenant. Now, because of the work that we're doing and other people are doing, when we ask that question, it's like 90% of the crowd, which is just wild to me that we've gotten to the stage in Minnesota. But this is an example of a racial covenant, and I'll read this text. The party of the second part hereby agrees that the premises hereby conveyed shall not at any time be conveyed, mortgaged, or leased to any person or persons of Chinese, Japanese, Moorish, Turkish, Negro, Mongolian, or African blood or descent, spelled incorrectly. So let's start with that part. This is the earliest racial covenant that we have found in Minnesota. This is from South Minneapolis, and it's from 1910. And this is from a property that Henry and Leonora Scott sold to Nels Anderson, who is a Swedish baker. And I think when people think about the history of racial covenants, they think, well, this must have been like really nice house. And it's actually not often the case. We find that a lot of covenants are on very modest houses, and this one was on a very modest house. And the next thing I want to call your attention to is, it's a little bit cut off here, but it says, said restrictions and covenants shall run with the land. And what that means is that this isn't just a restriction that went on this property for this sale. When we say it runs with the land, what we mean is that the next time that that property gets sold, that restriction is still in place. And so theoretically, that house could get sold 5 more times, and that racial restriction would still be in place. And anyone who breached that covenant, even after the property had changed hands several times, risked ending up in court and losing all of the equity that they had acquired in the property. And that breach triggered a process that would put the land back into the hands of the person who originally put the covenant into place, or if that person had died, it would go to his or her heirs. So there was quite a strong penalty for violating this covenant that was on this house. Here's another example. The land hereby conveyed shall not at any time be conveyed, mortgaged, or leased to any person or persons of Chinese, Japanese, Moorish, Turkish, Negro, Mongolian, Semitic, or African blood or descent. And in both of these two, I think we've seen some terms that are not particularly familiar to us today as contemporary racial terms. And the one especially I mentioned here is Mongolian. And to understand what some of this language is talking about, you have to understand sort of 19th century, early 20th century race science, in air quotes. And so Mongolian includes Asian people, like for sure. But Mongolian also is, we think, it includes Native American or First Nations people, because in that time period, the racist white science, race science, considered the Native American people to be part of the Mongolian race of people. And so like it theoretically applied to both. But I think we have to say that like we have to be very careful when we're interpreting these terms today, because their meaning was fluid then, and it's fluid now. And it is always dangerous to make assumptions about what's included. So for example, like Turkish, does Turkish mean people from Turkey, or does it reflect some kind of ethnic identity? Like Moorish, what does Moorish encompass? And I think this illustrates both this language that we find very offensive now, but it also shows kind of what's wrong with, another thing that's wrong with racial covenants is that they're trying to put into legal practice this nebulous concept that is not actually definable in reality, right? I mean, and so that it's, and you can see to what length people are going to try to systematize this nebulous concept of race. So this one, no persons of any race other than the Aryan race shall use or occupy any building or any lot. And what I think is most surprising about this one, in addition to the shocking language, is that this is from 1946 in Minneapolis. Like we just finished fighting World War II, and people are putting Aryan into new deeds. There's a couple of examples of this around Minneapolis. Said premises should not at any time be sold, conveyed, leased, or subletted or occupied by any person or persons who are not full bloods of the so-called Caucasian or white race. And so here we have the concept of blood being brought in, and you also see a shift away from language saying who cannot live there, and now we're saying who can live there, and now suddenly it's white people or Caucasian people. Again, not really a definable concept in reality, but something that people are putting into place. And this is a trend we see over the lifespan of racial covenants in the United States, is that we start out with this exclusionary language and move to this thing, who can live there instead. And we think this is because of standardization that we'll talk about in a little bit, and also some court challenges that because of these nebulous terms that are being used, there's worry that people might slip through the cracks and say, oh, well, I'm Filipino, I'm not Mongolian, things like that. And so there's this effort to make these as strong as they possibly can be in being exclusionary. There's similar language here, but I want to call attention to the second part of this one, which says, except that this covenant shall not prevent occupancy by domestic servants of a different race domiciled with an owner or tenant. This is incredibly common in racial covenants, that there's this exception built in for domestic servants. And I think this again shows a really important function of the way racial covenants are working. They're not just restrictions on property. They're not just restrictions on a home. They're also re-articulating appropriate social roles for people and codifying this into the law. And this document here, this is the racial covenant that I want to say, this is the one that's on my parents' house in Eau Claire, Wisconsin. And this is actually the way that I first encountered racial covenants was when my parents, when I was about 12 or 13, refinanced the mortgage on their house. And they said, and I'm not sure if the mortgage broker found this or they found this, but somewhere in the history of the title, they found this text. And the way it was presented to me is my parents said, well, there's this weird thing in our deed. It says that a Black person can't own our house. And the reason I bring this up is because I want to talk about my positionality, but also my reaction to that at the time. Because at the time, my reaction to that was, well, what a strange thing. There's not even any Black people that live here. Why would you need that? And the fact that I didn't make a connection between those two things, I think says a lot about where people are coming from, and also the effect that covenants had being so dramatic and long lasting in a lot of these neighborhoods that the people who live there now can't even conceive of a different type of neighborhood. They're so used to this all white neighborhood that the idea that it might have been something different is just not imaginable. And I think that I think this has to do with the time that covenants are going in a lot of these places in US cities is the time when the cities as we know them are being developed. And so now we have this idea in our culture of this single family neighborhood, either in a city or suburban, that is largely white. And I think racial covenants are a big reason for why we have this mental image in addition to all the economic issues that we're going to talk about. But I don't say this to say I also want to talk about so what does it mean that I didn't know anything about this? Why didn't my parents know anything about this? And partly what I didn't understand and they didn't understand is they didn't have the context is that it's not just our house, it's every house in this block. And that the covenants are actually there before the houses are there. Because a lot of the ways that this works in cities where covenants are going in the 20s is in a lot of cases, when the land is sold off to be developed into a residential neighborhood, the person who sells that land puts the covenant on most or all of the properties as an added amenity. And so it doesn't really do any good to put a covenant on a single house, when we think about it. Because why covenant a single house? If it's your house, just don't sell it to a Black person if you don't want a Black person to live there. For these to work, you have to do a section of the neighborhood in order to protect everybody. And so that's why these go in over wide swaths of an area at a time, generally. There's different patterns in different types of cities, but in Minnesota and in Wisconsin, that were not major destinations of the first great migration of Black people into cities, this is more the pattern that we see, is that the covenants go in before houses. In cities that have a longer history of larger Black populations, industrial cities like Chicago, St. Louis, you see these types of covenants, but you also see covenants that are called, I'm missing the word right now, petition covenants, where neighbors who already live in a neighborhood are concerned about the theoretical Black encroachment and get together and sign a document that promises we will not sell to a Black person. And that's coming in after the houses, but that's more of a norm in these more industrial cities. Is this going to work? It's working, yay. And the other thing that I didn't understand and my parents didn't understand is that it's not just my neighborhood. In Minneapolis and St. Paul, it's covering large swaths of the city. And you can see really large parts of the city of Minneapolis and the area around it where that is just only available exclusively for white people to settle. And I think the other thing I know we're not in Minnesota, so I can't presume a lot of geographical knowledge about Minneapolis, but what you can see, get my mouse on this screen, is this is the city limits of Minneapolis right here, and I'll come back in a second. And what we see is this wall of covenants around the boundary of the city of Minneapolis. And so one of the functions of covenants is to serve as a barrier to prevent people from moving into these new suburbs that are these now desirable suburbs. And you sort of see two phases. I guess you can't actually see the years here, but right now what we're seeing, this is probably the 20s or the 30s. And then as we get into the 40s, we see these spots showing up in sort of this lake region. And there's generally in the US that we know so far, there's kind of two peaks of covenant activity. There's like a peak that starts in about 1910, and peaks in 1925. then drops off pretty significantly as the depression takes hold and housing development kind of like is depressed. And so I think two things happen there. One is there's just not that much development going on. And two, in some cases, people view covenants as not a smart investment anymore. They want to sell to anyone they possibly can. But I think that second factor is less important than just there's just not very much building going on. And then coming out of World War II in the United States, there's a huge boom in development that happens to alleviate a major housing crisis. And then you have a second wave of suburban development, and that's sort of the second peak. So, but this still doesn't really explain why my family didn't know anything about these before we encountered one on our deed. And this is a newspaper ad that was in the paper in the teens. These covenants were not a secret. They were advertised as amenities. They were advertised. The text of this covenant is in the newspaper ad for the subdivision. And it says, fourth, that granting you cannot sell or lease said real estate to a colored person. You have my assurance that the above restrictions will be enforced to the fullest extent of the law. And these covenants are put in place by this man, Thomas Frankson. And Thomas Frankson wasn't just anybody. He was a state legislator and later a lieutenant governor of Minnesota. And so when he said fullest extent of the law, that meant something theoretically. And another thing that's really interesting about this is that a thing that has been asserted often in the history of race in the United States is you hear a lot of times, well, immigrants had it hard too, right? Like, and so maybe this isn't just about race, maybe it's about economics. What this is that same newspaper ad in Swedish. And so this is an example showing that Swedish people were welcomed into this concept of whiteness. You're welcome in this neighborhood. You can take advantage of these covenants, whereas other people were not. And so I think what we're seeing is that for immigrants that are now considered white, these restrictions didn't apply to them. They were invited to take part in this whiteness. Now, another reason that's so curious that I didn't know about them is because everywhere that someone has looked, we find them. This is one from a rural Minnesota county, and there's also research going on in Milwaukee County. We find them in Milwaukee County. Then they're in Seattle, Detroit, Washington, D.C. These are in every city in the United States. Like we know they're everywhere. And in fact, like I don't know very much about Canadian covenants, but this is an example from Canada. This one is in West Vancouver, British Columbia, which I found this from a newspaper article. And this one says, do I have an inset for this one? Yeah. No persons of the African or Asiatic race or of African or Asiatic descent, except servants of the occupants of the premises and residents, shall reside or be allowed to remain on like premises. And this one, I don't have a picture of this one, but this one is from Grand Bend, Ontario, which is, I don't really know where that is, but it's along one of the lakes west of Toronto. No person of Jewish, Hebrew, Semitic, Negro, or colored race or blood. And I want to make 2 points here. It's like one is that like in a lot of ways these look pretty similar to the U.S. covenants. Like so this, I would not blink seeing this language in the United States. But one thing that we know is the case in the United States that I don't know about Canada, and I wager that no one really knows yet, is that in the United States, other groups come and go, like Jewish people, Hispanic people in some parts of the country, Asian people. But every single covenant that we found is targeting Black people. It might target other people in addition, but I think it's always important to say that is that there is a unique and specific anti-Blackness that pervades all of the US covenants. And then the additional ones may or may not show up. And there's definitely regional differences. On the West Coast, you're more likely to see Asian people being targeted. In the southern United States, you're seeing people of Mexican American heritage being targeted to some extent. But I don't actually know what that will look like in Canada. And I would love, if people know more, I would love to know more about that. But it's hard enough talking about the history of race and racism in the United States. I am not going to attempt to characterize that in Canada because I am so far out of my depth on that. But why do these covenants come to cover so much of the United States? And a big part of the answer is that what starts out as something that people are trying out as an amenity becomes a best practice. And this is from the manual of the National Association of Realtors, who in 1908 developed a code of ethics. And the code declared in part that it was unethical for a real estate agent to introduce into a neighborhood members of any race or nationality whose presence will clearly be detrimental to property values. And so realtors promoted covenants as a tool for keeping neighborhoods racially homogenous, which they believed or said would protect property values. But not only did they have this in their code of ethics, they also created model covenants for their members and encouraged them to be incorporated into new development. And then what starts out as this private practice gets a big boost when the Federal Housing Administration in 1938, in their federal underwriting manual, basically adopts covenants as a best practice. And so what we see is government officials at every level support the use of covenants. And when and this is from the 1938 Federal Underwriting Manual, it states that the most favorable loan rates, the FHA is giving like good favorable loan terms on housing on housing in the U.S. The most favorable rates should only be granted, quote, where effective restrictive covenants are recorded against the entire tract, meaning the subdivision, since these provide the surest protection against undesirable encroachment and inharmonious use. And so I think that they use the terms encroachment, inharmonious use, and then previously, in the previous one, we heard about property values. And these three concepts like are encoded into not only development at the time, but I think one of the things that's interesting is when racial covenants are outlawed by court action, and we'll talk about that in a second, the racial language gets crossed out. So let's think about those concepts for a second. All three of those concepts are still present in our modern day property development. And so I think it's interesting to consider like that these concepts are all developed at the same time as racial covenants. And so like, that's not to say that every single bit of those things is racial or has racial connotations, but these are part of the same project and are developed at the same time. And I think that's important to keep in mind. Let's see, where are we now? Oh yeah, and then I already talked about that. So this is the city of Minneapolis and the city of St. Paul in 1910, and the purple here is Black population. One of the things that I was raised with in my understanding of race in the United States is I had this impression that the further you go back in history, the worse the segregation was, and that even though things are perfect, that segregation is less today than it was in the past. And I think one of the things that we can learn from this history is that that's not the case. That actually, in 1910, Black people, though there was not large numbers of Black people living in the Twin Cities, are able to live in a lot of the developed parts of the Twin Cities. They're not really restricted from living in neighborhoods. By the time you get to 1920, and you can see the green here is the first round of racial covenants coming in, you can already see a little bit of a difference where Black people are being increasingly concentrated into a smaller number of neighborhoods, but still there's Black population in a lot of the city. By 1930, I think you can really start to see, especially in this part of South Minneapolis, the covenants are starting to take what was an area where there's more Black population and start to move it around. And really by 1940, you can see there are now almost no Black people in this neighborhood where covenants have gone in. And furthermore, where in 1910, there were very few neighborhoods that were majority Black. Now you start having, well, I guess this isn't majority, but like that were like over 25% Black. The people are increasingly being concentrated into smaller and smaller areas. And that's partially by racial covenants moving people around. And, oh yeah, well, and I'll come back to that in a second. So that's 1940. And if you look at a map of 2020, in Minneapolis and St. Paul, the neighborhoods that were covered by covenants are still the whitest parts of the city today. This is not true everywhere, which is interesting. And this is emerging research. Right now we're doing Milwaukee, and Milwaukee looks a little different. I think if you look at Milwaukee in 1940, this would be a very similar picture. But in some other cities, what you see is that there's in Minneapolis, we think that there's a difference in the history of what's called blockbusting, where like people would come in and try to flip neighborhoods that were seeing a few Black people move in. They say they go to homeowners, real estate agents come to homeowners and say, oh, well, you better get out now because Black people have moved in, but don't worry, we're here to help. We'll buy your house off of you. And then they buy the house at a low rate and then sell that house to a Black family and flip the neighborhood essentially. Minneapolis doesn't seem to have as strong of a history of that. They definitely have white flight. But if you look at Milwaukee, by 1960, 1970, you see covenants in neighborhoods that are today like very Black neighborhoods, which is a little bit of a different system. And I think we'll talk more about that a little later. But the other thing that's happening in this time period, and now my years are blocked off, is that covenants are also being put in at this moment where white society has decided it's no longer permissible for Black people to be in these spaces that they now feel need to be exclusively white spaces. And that's enforced in two ways. One is the covenants, and two is with violence. And what we see in this time period is not a rise in the KKK, which I guess I don't want to presume people's knowledge in Canada of the American KKK. The KKK has a really big national peak in the 1920s. They're a very public organization. It's kind of cool to be in the KKK. There's parades in every city. It's very mainstream before kind of collapsing under pressure. But in addition to stuff that is like obviously the KKK, you have a lot of early neighborhood associations that call themselves neighborhood improvement associations. And one of the things that they do is they help to push people out of neighborhoods that have either been there a long time or that have started to move into town. And so these are different newspaper accounts of people being violently pushed out, whether through cross burnings, pretend lynchings, mobs showing up at your business or your home. Very, very legal action, very intense terror that goes hand in hand with the covenants. And so moving into one of these neighborhoods is what Arthur and Edith Lee did in 1931 when they bought a bungalow in South Minneapolis. And when neighbors found out that a Black family was moving in, they organized Stop the Sale. They called the realtor, the bank, the city council, other neighbors. What can we do about this? And when the Lees ignored their pleas and their threats and moved into their house, they found themselves under sustained attack. This photo on the right here, that is a crowd outside their house of 6,000 people that gathered around their house. They tried to burn down the house. They threatened to murder the family. They shot out the windows and threw black paint on the siding, which you can see here. And this is Mary and Edith Lee in front of their house. Arthur Lee was a World War I veteran, and his fellow soldiers showed up to basically keep him from being lynched in the house. But under pressure, they eventually moved out of the neighborhood under this incredible amount of pressure and violence. So as we move a little forward in time then, from the 20s, then we have this term that people are relatively familiar with, which is the idea of redlining. And redlining is this idea that the federal government comes in and makes these maps and says, some areas are desirable for lending, and banks, yes, you should lend here, and some areas are not. And this is what's called the Hulk map for Minneapolis and St. Paul. And areas that are red are considered hazardous for lending, and lenders should not lend there. But what I want us to notice about those redlining maps is if you can think back to where the Black population was, surprise, surprise, the red areas, often, not exclusively, but often are very strongly correlated with where people of color are living. And so there's this process where covenants have forced Black people particularly into smaller and smaller areas. And now the government's drawing a circle around them and says, don't lend here. And this is creating these areas that are now, instead of being invested in and kept up, are being divested from and are facing a lot of pressure to maintain themselves. And then we move a little more farther. We have the 1944 Servicemen's Readjustment Act, or what's called in the U.S. the GI Bill. And the GI Bill is soldiers are coming back from World War II. There's a really acute housing crisis. There's not nearly enough houses for everybody. And so the federal government gets involved in a really big way and gives very advantageous lending terms for soldiers to buy houses. But the Senate was not unaware that there were many Black servicemen who were going to be able to take advantage of the benefits of this program potentially. And the GI Bill doesn't cover just housing, it also covers education and other programs. And so for a lot of Southern Democrats, this was a non-starter. We do not want a bill like this interfering with the Jim Crow system that we have. And so one of the key concessions that was baked into this bill to get it passed is that the individual states would administer it instead of the federal government as a way to keep the Jim Crow South system intact. And it's actually very hard to get data on the lending, partly because of the state by state nature of this, but very few Black people are able to get home loans as part of this. And this is really important because this is a moment in time where it's not just that Black people are disadvantaged in this, it's that for white people, this is a massive expansion of the ability to own a home and to get a foot on the ladder of wealth accumulation. This is a really key moment where, for me as a white person in this country, my family is able to get a rung on that ladder, start building generational wealth. And so it's not just that Black people are disadvantaged, it's that white people are advantaged by this. And so then we move forward a little more in time, and this is our 1940 population of Black people. And as you get into the late 50s, early 60s, the freeways come through. And lo and behold, the freeways are looking for places that they can acquire large amounts of land at the cheapest price available. And also, one of the stated goals of the federal policy is to clear blight, which is considered like neighborhoods that like need to be redeveloped, and to go through what are called slums. And in some cases, they're very overtly referring to needing to clear out Black population. Not in every single case, but the federal government makes no secret of the fact that one of the intentions of this is to clear what they consider to be slums. And lo and behold, the interstates managed to find every Black neighborhood in the Twin Cities. And this is another moment where, after being pushed into smaller and smaller areas, and after being redlined, now the freeway comes through and it displaces people. And those displaced people can't go anywhere else because of the hostile environment that they're going into. Even where there's not covenants, there is strong resistance to Black people moving into a neighborhood. And in both Minneapolis and St. Paul, they try to pass a fair housing bill to open housing, and that bill fails. And so Black people are both displaced and then not able to find anywhere, which leads to a further concentration of Black people and poverty in these neighborhoods. And so you find like disproportionate shares of Black people and other minorities living near freeways, which in addition to being less valuable, also exposes you to more pollution and lack of amenities. And, these are ads that people put in the paper desperately looking for housing, trying to figure out a way to relocate. And then after that, and here's a brief summary of like, why don't we have this today? So brief history of legal action. Going back to 1917, one of the reasons we have racial covenants is before there's racial covenants, the US tries racial zoning, meaning basically Black people can only live here. And the court says, you can't do that. The government can't do that. But private contracts might be okay. And this is viewed as sort of the end of racial zoning, but also gives a green light to covenants. And there's a big part of why covenants sort of move forward into the future. In this varies state by state, but in 1919, Minnesota outlaws religious covenants. And so theoretically, covenants against Jewish people explicitly is no longer allowed. Although it's really arguable about when someone says white only, Caucasian only, does that include Jews or doesn't it? And I think the answer is sometimes it does and sometimes it doesn't. And it depends on who's asking. In the 1940s, the NAACP launches a national legal campaign against racial covenants, which culminates in the 1948 Supreme Court ruling, Shelley versus Kramer, which rules that covenants are unenforceable. And the reason I'm emphasizing unenforceable is because, like, well after 1948, new racial covenants are going in across the country. And if you remember that, like, outer area of lakes, a lot of those are going in the early 50s. So just because they're unenforceable, people are still trying to send a message, right? And like, even if you're not going to get taken to court, I think there's a high bar for someone to either want to come into that neighborhood and feel welcome, or for a homeowner who might be interested in selling to view it as an acceptable risk. And then sort of the end of the covenants era, we think, is the 1968 passage of the U.S. Fair Housing Act. And I say we think because, like, we haven't really looked past 1968, but I think like they're drastically dropping off. So, like, by the mid 50s, although our latest example in Minnesota is from 1962, 1963. So back to it's the wrong notes. But I think you're like, I want to get back to my question from long ago, which is, but so why didn't my family know about these? they're not a secret. They're hugely influential. And what happens is after 1968, there's a rush to forget among white people that this ever happened. But like I said, in the 1940s, this was the main topic of resistance by the NAACP. These were not secret. But suddenly, everyone decided we just want to forget about that. The past is past. Fair housing is in place. But why is it important to pull? I mean, one, it's important to remember, like we have this willful amnesia about this period. But also, when we look today, out of the 25 most populous U.S. metro areas, Minneapolis has the highest share of residents, of white residents that are on their home. Oh, I'm sorry, the highest share of residents that are on their home, and the largest racial disparity. And there's something like a 50 percentage point gap between white home ownership and black home ownership. And this is a big part of the reason why. I'm going to skip this because Dr. Sue's going to talk about that. So how do we find racial covenants? The problem with them finding them, and people have been trying to find them since they were in place to try to quantify how many of these are there out there. The problem is now that these are just stored on microfilm generally, and maybe digitized microfilm. And so what Mapping Prejudice did, and my predecessor Kevin did, is develop this process where we get the county, who is the keeper of the deeds or the records, because it's more than deeds, to give us a giant hard drive of all of their scanned microfilm for their property records. We then run that through optical character recognition, and have a set of racial terms that we know appear in racial covenants, and we flag them as, hey, we think there's a racial covenant in here. But like OCR is not good enough to really transcribe stuff accurately, and it's not very good at interpreting complex things like a property record where things are going to be all over the place in a document. And so we have volunteers transcribe the covenants. And not only do they transcribe the text of the covenant, they also transcribe the property information and the property records. Because when I first got this job, I assumed, oh, well, that's kind of hard, but you just get the address off the property deed, right? But the address is not actually in the property deeds. The property deeds refer to what's called an addition, block, and lot. So it's actually somewhat difficult to join into a modern map, and so that's kind of where our process comes in. And our process now, we basically, it's sort of a two-part process. On the front end, we basically have a cloud computing system that OCRs all the documents at a much faster scale. This used to take us months to do a single county. We've now got this down to like a couple of days to run the OCR process. And really the hard part in this right now is getting the records, like either finding a county that has the records in the digitized format and then negotiating with them to give them to us is really a challenge. And so after we OCR all that, we import that into our database, and then we're able to upload the hits, essentially, ones we think that have covenants, to our volunteer platform, which we're going to do some transcription later today. But basically, we show each deed, we show to 5 different volunteers at random who sign it. This is what we're going to do later. And they confirm, is there really a covenant, copy the language, identify the property, get the date, and then say, yep, that's done. And then we take those 5 responses and we compare them to each other. And by comparing them to each other, if all 5 people agreed that this is the date, we can be very confident that really is the date. Like maybe one person made a mistake. It's unlikely that 5 people made the same mistake, right? And so this actually gives us quite a bit of confidence in our results. And I think one of the points of resistance that people have had to doing the data this way is there's this assumption that, well, really you should train some grad students who are experts, right, to do this transcription. Well, but even someone who's an expert makes mistakes, first of all. And when you're having one person transcribe something, if someone makes a mistake, how are you ever going to know about it? But with this, we're able to flag mistakes. The second thing is that, I don't know how many grad students you have, but we went through 20,000 records in Hennepin County, and there is just no way on earth you're going to have expert researchers be able to go through all of these hits. And so we need the volunteers to do this process. And this crowdsourcing process gives us more accuracy than having specialists do it. Then we get to the mapping. And basically we have a bunch of standardized scripts that take the address information that we get and standardizes them. And the way this works is that, so for each individual record, the property information is going to be there's the addition, the block, and the lot. And so in this case, the record would be, the addition is John Smith's second addition to the city of St. Paul, block 2, lots 1 to 3. And so the system is going to then generate a series of what we call join candidates. And you can see here, we've taken that John Smith second edition to the city of St. Paul and simplified that down to John Smith second, block 2, lot 1. We've sort of taken out, so what have we taken out? We've taken out addition to the city of St. Paul, because maybe in the old document it says that, but maybe in the new one it doesn't. And we sort of know that's a pattern. So we have a script that says anything that says addition to the city of something, something, take that off. And then we also upload a modern parcel shapefile that has like modern property information that's got that same information there. So in this case, maybe the addition is John Smith's second ADD with an apostrophe N. So if we just did a straight match on those two things, that's not going to match. And so we run that stuff through the same process. And so we end up with join strings that are simplified versions. So like ADD apostrophe N, common abbreviation for addition. So we simplified that out. And then, oh, look, we got these two things are the same. And so the system knows that these are the same two properties. And so now we've linked that old document to a modern parcel on the map, and now we can map it. And that's the process in a nutshell. And then a certain percentage of these just join automatically. If the property information is nice and clean and the modern records are nice and clean, then these things that joins up. And so it's always very exciting when I download a new round of covenants from our crowdsourcing platform, because we'll get like a couple hundred covenants just like right off the bat, and that's very fun. But for the rest of them, we have to do some manual cleanup. Like maybe the addition is not super similar. Maybe there's some disagreement among the volunteers, and so we have this like interactive database system where people clean that stuff up. So I think the question we get all the time is like, okay, in order to run this process, what do you have to do? First, you need digital images of historic property records. And when I say digitize, people sometimes think I mean something different when I say digitize. One version of digitization is you transcribe all the data from that document into a database, right? Like we actually don't need that. And that's very rare for this time period, for like 1900 to 1970. All we really need is that someone has scanned the microfilm or scanned their original books, and we essentially get a big series of JPEGs. And so that's what we're starting with, because then we can run the OCR scripts and start the process. As I mentioned earlier, really the hardest part of this, the thing that takes the longest time, is negotiating with the property records custodians to trust you to hand over these large amounts of data. Now, in the US, property records are public records. Theoretically, they should say, yep, here you go. Thanks for asking. But that's only happened like 1 or 2 times. And we value those records custodians very much. But for a lot of property record custodians in the US, they're not very well funded. Their office is not well funded. And the way that they stay solvent is they sell their data to companies like Zillow and other places, which, I mean, we have thoughts about whether that should be that way, but like that is the case. And so they're often very nervous about giving us a second set of these documents that are then out there, which we don't have any interest in selling them. And like we've had to reassure records custodians that someone's not going to basically be able to scrape our data and reassemble all of the property records. I mean, if you were going to do that with our system, it would be a very, very dissatisfying experience. There are much easier ways to scrape things than use our system. But we have to basically negotiate MOUs with these counties to get access to the bulk data. And that process takes a long time. You need people who understand that and have a commitment to that process. You also need modern parcel records that can be parsed in this like addition block lot way. I don't know anything about property records in Canada, so I don't know how comparable this is. But especially on the East Coast of the United States, we have a lot more property that doesn't really look like that. It's covered by physical descriptions. So instead of like addition block lot, it'll say the property bounded by a tree over here, and then 30 feet to the east, and then 30 feet to the south. So like older property is a challenge for us. And so the addition block lot is something that comes in the early 1800s and covers a lot of the old West and the West, so kind of the western 3/4 of the United States. And another big thing is the willingness to do community engagement. And this has been another thing that's been a hard sell, like for some people. Like a lot of the researchers who do this are academics, and the last thing I want to do is be talking to people, especially like letting them and like losing control over the research, right, from their perspective. But again, like I outlined, is like one, there's two things we say all the time. The process is the product. And what we see when we do this transcription, and I think we'll see a little bit today, is that it brings volunteers into contact with these primary source documents. And they see these things for the first time. And we try really hard to have people do transcription for their own city. And so not only are you seeing these racial restrictions, you're seeing these in places that you recognize. And so it really brings it home that this is a thing that happened in your town, in places you recognize. Maybe you'll even see names you recognize. So one, that's a very important part of what we're trying to do. Like we are trying to make a case for reparations, essentially. And so we need people to have this experience of seeing that these things were real and were in our place. But also, as I outlined, if we got 20,000 deeds to go through, we can't do it any other way. There really is no other way to do it. And so I think it's a really nice virtuous cycle where we both need the volunteers and it does a lot of the work we want to do by having them. And then another thing is that it's just a deal breaker for us. Like we are going to make the resulting data and maps public. That's a really important part of the process. Again, for some academics and for some policymakers, that's a hard sell. Like they feel like we're going to put all this time into this data. We don't necessarily want to make it open, but we won't work with anyone who does that. Another thing I'll just briefly say, like it's not just deeds. Covenants are found in deeds, plat maps, restriction agreements, petition covenants, court orders, even wills, all kinds of miscellaneous documents. So if you're spinning up your own covenant project, you need to ask for everything. And this is sort of, we've had to widen the scope of what we look for over time. We also work very closely with a coalition of people called Just Deeds. And this spun up because once people found out that they had a racial covenant on their property, they wanted to figure out, well, how do I get it? How do I get it off? I don't want this on my property. And honestly, like when we first encountered people with this question, we sort of, and this is before my time actually, but like helping white people feel better about this deed that's on their property is not really our top priority, like, to be honest. I mean, and so like, it's good that people feel like bad and ashamed of this history, but removing this language from your deed is not going to fix it. It's not going to help it's not going to help people of color in any way. And what's been happening since 1968 is this race to forget about this. Like that, like forgetting has always been part of the process. But with Just Deeds, and Just Deeds is a coalition of like lawyers and realtors, kind of had to convince us of, but now we are thoroughly convinced of, is that like this is an opportunity to have a conversation with people who benefited from this history largely, and to start that conversation about, okay, like you found out that this thing happened, let's talk about what you're going to do next, and let's talk about the fact that getting rid of this language is not going to fix anything. And so if you care about fixing the damage that covenants and other things did, this is the start of the conversation, not the end of the conversation. And they have been our fiercest advocates and have spread this information out. And what's come out of this coalition and stuff that to me just blows my mind. So the Minneapolis area realtors issued an apology for decades of their past practices. And like, again, an apology doesn't fix stuff either. But to me, the idea that like realtors would apologize for these practices, which were so integral to the building of their field, is really wild to me. And so like, it's not every realtor, but especially for realtors of color, this has been a really powerful vehicle for them to sort of be listened to when they're having the conversations that they've been trying to have all along about the history of our organization. And I think so we work a lot with Just Deeds, who helps us coordinate the discharge process. And so again, I want to talk about this now, including this in all of our talks, because as racial covenants have become more prominent in the U.S. consciousness, people wanted to get rid of them. And so different states are passing laws all the time right now, and some of them are better than others. And one of the big things is that people say, well, we want to get rid of them. And some of these laws make it sound like the county recorder needs to take whiteouts with a microfilm and like white out that original language. And we want to say like, please don't do that. And so the way the process works in Minnesota is we're not deleting language from the original records. There's a discharge of a racial covenant. And what a discharge is an additional document that is filed with the property that says there was a racial covenant here. Really crucially, here's where it was, so someone can find it again. And we disavow that covenant, but we're not deleting the original record, and that's important for a couple of reasons. One is because the vast majority of the places in the United States have not been studied yet. And there's still we have so many questions about like how these work in different places. But two, we don't think that destroying historical records is the right approach to this. And actually it's illegal in most places. You can't just like white out property record information. But I think that's a really important, like as these conversations begin happening in Canada, I think there's already a little bit of this debate going on, but I think I just want to put us on record and saying, please try to have a discussion about not getting rid of the old records while the disavowal is happening. But I also want to say, like, I think the positionality of who is asking makes a really big difference. And so like I said before, when we go to a neighborhood that is mostly white and people say, we want to get rid of this language, we want to get rid of this language, I'm not super interested, right? Like, I mean, we'll help with that process, but that's not our goal. It makes a big difference if in a community like North Milwaukee, where today that is a Black community, and if the Black community says, we want to get rid of these, we need to listen to that in a different way. And so I just think like as that conversation goes on, we need to make sure that we're understanding the various reasons that people have for wanting to or not wanting to get rid of this language, and to include that nuance in the conversation. Excuse me, in the conversation. Real quick, what you can do, help research covenants. Really importantly, tell people about this history. I think especially having white people talk about this history makes a big difference, because that's what's been missing. Again, this is I'm saying this from a U.S. context. Black people have been talking about this history while it was going on, and since then, they just haven't been listened to. And so we shouldn't be talking about these like, oh, we just discovered these. It's time that we're talking about them as white people, but people have been talking about them the whole time. Be honest about your institution's role and your own positionality in this. And people ask us all the time, like, okay, so what should we do, right? Like, what are the reparations we should do? And our answer is, you should listen to the people who have been talking about this for the entire time, and talk to them about what they want and what they need. We're going to do a transcription session in a little bit, but if you want, this is the QR code for our volunteer page. And we hold weekly transcription sessions. We're currently doing Milwaukee. And after that, I think I've gone long, so I will turn it over to Dr. Sue. We're going to do questions at the end, right? We're going to do questions at the end.
Well, does anyone have any pressing questions now? We can answer them, especially if they're clarification questions. Otherwise, we can refer to Q&A later.
And you can set up and all.
Okay.
Any questions? Okay. Pass it down.
No. We may have to move this. I think I got it. Okay. Then, let's see. No. Where did it go? Sorry, just give us a second. I'm just switching slides here. Yeah, I think I might need help. Yeah, it's on the other screen because what's being shared is over there. And we can make it a big screen.
Yes. Oh.
I see to click share first.
Oh. I can't read.
Hi. We just need to make that full screen.
Yeah.
This is PowerPoint.
It's a PDF.
It's PDF. Let's do this. Send.
Yeah, we can just have it
Bring it
here.
here.
Perfect.
Let's just, yeah. And then, sorry about that.
Okay, perfect. So thank you to Michael for explaining the big history of racial covenants. Thank you to Mapping Prejudice for collecting the first ever data set so we can actually study some of these questions. I should say that their data is publicly available. So to all the graduate students out here, this data is out there. More data is being collected for Milwaukee, for St. Louis, for Washington, D.C., for Chicago. So if you're a graduate student looking to study this data is being collected and can be used. Okay, so my name is Aradhya Sood. I'm an assistant professor at UTSC and Rotman School of Management. I'm going to be talking about what do you do once you get this map, once you get this data, how do you take it and study a question? Many other questions can be answered. I'm talking about long shadow of racial discrimination, evidence from housing covenants, which are these racial covenants. And this paper is co-authored with one of the Mapping Prejudice people, Kevin Ehrman Solberg. So I'm not going to delve too much into the history here, but let me put this into context. Across North American cities, this is true for Canadian cities as well, we observe persistent neighborhood level racial segregation even today. But as Michael was mentioning, this was not always the case, right? At the turn of the 20th century to mid-20th century, a couple of things happened. First, if you look at segregation at the end of 1900s, at the end of 1800s or the beginning of 1900s, segregation is not a neighborhood level phenomena. It's a building by building level of segregation. In addition, as being documented by sociologists, economists, historians, between 1890 and 1950, the level of segregation in the cities increased more than 2 times, right? That's double the amount of segregation that we see. So if you look at a neighborhood in the 1940s and 50s, it's segregated at a neighborhood level, and it's twice as much segregation you would see at a city level as you would have seen at the turn of the 20th century. Now, there are many, many instruments and methods of segregation that are ongoing at the time that we're talking about here in the beginning to mid 20th century. The first zoning regulations are adopted. There's redlining. There's suburbanization, although that's a little bit in the 40s and 50s. And then there's racially restrictive covenants. That's the focus here. But it's a broad array of discriminatory instruments that we're participating in. Now, I won't go into details here because Michael has done this for us. But just to sort of specify, this is a part of your property deed that's prohibiting who can live there. This is one of the examples that he used, and they are everywhere in United States, and a couple of examples from our Canadian cities as well. And they're legally enforceable until 1948. So once you get this data, you can ask many questions. The one question that this paper is asking is, what are the persistent causal effects of these racially restrictive covenants on city structures today? So how have covenants of the past, if at all, affected segregation and homeownership differential across race over the end of the 20th century and beginning of the 21st century? And how has it affected house price differential today? Now, why are these questions important to study? Well, we know from a lot of research that what neighborhood you grow in has an effect on your economic mobility, what type of school you go to. So if covenants that are no longer enforceable of the past still have an effect on where people of color live today, that's going to have an effect on mobility today. In addition, if we find that there are house price differentials even today, 70 years after these covenants were made unenforceable. Well, and the places that didn't have covenants still attract minority residents. Well, if you're going to start forming wealth, especially through housing, it will affect racial wealth formation today, and it would be different across different races. So the methodology for this is we're going to focus on a really narrow, so covenants are for the first half of 20th century, they're taking place. But we're going to focus on a narrow window between 1940 and 1960 and do what economists call a regression discontinuity design around the 1948 US Supreme Court ruling that made these covenants unenforceable. And basically compare houses and neighborhoods that were built right before this ruling and right after this ruling, where they're controlling for similar neighborhood aspects. The only difference is the ones built before had a positive probability of having a covenant, hence minorities couldn't live there, and the ones later had a positive probability of having a more mixed race neighborhood. So if you compare them, look at how those neighborhoods have evolved over a period of time, we'll be able to tell if these covenants of the past have a persistent effect today. And then we're going to delve into a little bit of why do we see persistent effects. There are basically three reasons why you would see persistent effects. One comes from homophily bias, which is even if you remove covenants, and we know, and I'll show you some data, that people live in their houses for a median of 15 years, even if you're moving into a covenant neighborhood in the 70s or 80s that has already doesn't have enforceable covenants anymore. But if you have a homophily bias that you want to live with people of your own race, you might move into a covenanted neighborhood. That might explain why there are persistent sorting effects. It could come from differences in public amenities, and it could come from differences in private investment, and I'll get into the details of that. So just really quickly, let me talk a little bit about some findings before I get into the details. So these are causal effects here. And what we find is that a 1% increase in covenanted houses in your census block is slightly bigger than a neighborhood block, reduces Black residents by 0.6 to 0.8%, and other racial minorities by 0.6 to 1%, so almost a 1 to 1% decrease between 1980 and 2020. So we have 5 decades of data, and you're still finding effects on where there are covenants, you find fewer minorities living. This is also the case of where minorities are owning homes. A 1% increase in covenanted houses in your census block reduces Black homeownership by 0.8 to 1%, and other minority homeownership by 0.7 to 0.8%. In addition to that, covenanted houses with similar characteristics in the same neighborhood versus the non-covenanted homes have a 4.6% higher home value in 2019 compared to the ones that do not. And here we're comparing similar houses in similar neighborhoods. And this difference is down, significantly down from what was the differential in 40s and 50s, which is around 56%, but there's still a 4.6% differential. So if you're thinking about what this means in terms of mobility and what it means in terms of racial wealth gap, there's some significant numbers here. So because we had a big, long presentation on the background to covenants, let me just put this in the context that I find useful in terms of thinking. So like all covenants, racial covenants run with land. Now, what this means is you can have other types of covenants on your property. Like you can have a covenant like don't put a dish satellite on your lawn or a yard, right? That's a covenant. It's fully legally enforceable. A racial covenant was a version of that. And as Michael said, the US Supreme Court was okay with it for the first half of 20th century because this was a private instrument that was being followed by developers and homeowners and neighbors, and not a government action. So it's a private instrument of discrimination with legal protection. And broadly speaking, we want to think a little bit about the types of racial covenants. Broadly speaking, they're developer-driven. They're about 94% in the sample that we'll look at. And some of them are sort of individual or neighborhood-driven, which are these petition covenants that Michael was talking about. And I'm not going to go into the developers who were actually advertising. They were advertising it, and why would they? Why would they charge a higher price once they advertise it? They're actually charging for a higher price because they're creating an all-white amenity, right? They're creating an all-white amenity in areas that had literal natural amenities. And we'll see some examples of these covenants are not added in places near lakes or rivers. They're actually added in places that had the least amount of natural amenities in lower middle class, white working class neighborhoods. I want to think a little bit about how these covenants work and try and connect them a little bit to zoning, which is not explicitly racial and covenants are, but they operate in a very similar way. Covenants, like zoning, is a restriction on what can be done with your property. So if you relax zoning or if you remove covenants, your option value actually goes up because now you can sell your house to anyone. And in terms of zoning, you can now do a bunch of different things with your property. Why do people value covenants? They don't value it because their house has it. It's more about your neighborhood having covenants. So it's an insurance against future neighborhood demographic change. And the enforcement of these covenants came as big legislatures were promoting them, but also there are several district, state, and U.S. Supreme Court cases that injured parties would bring lawsuits and they would be settled in courts. So why study racial covenants? We studied zoning, we've studied redlining. What are we getting by studying racial covenants? Like, why so much effort to try and collect them and study them? Well, one is we really have not gotten enough quantitative attention, right? And that's because there is no data. Before Mapping Prejudice, there is no data on where covenants are. So you can't be certain what houses have covenants and what don't. In addition, they're taking place at a time where segregation doubles as there is more Black migration from the South and international immigration, and the cities are urbanizing. That's the time when these covenants are active. In many US cities, it's also a crucial time period. This is when housing is very elastic. 44% of housing in Hennepin County, that's where Minneapolis is, was built in this time period between 1910 to 1948. So about 45% of housing that you see today was built in an environment where there were some kind of racial covenant. So even if you remove them, about half of the geography there is already settled because of the racial covenants that were taking place. Now, it's not obvious that covenants would matter in the long run, right? There are many instruments for neighbors, cities to discriminate. There is land use zoning, that the first one is in New York in 1916, but most other cities don't pick it up until 1940s. There is redlining, both through the Holt maps and from the Federal Housing Authority, but that's a discrimination that is happening through the mortgage or the lending channel. It's a less direct way to discriminate your neighborhood. And then there's suburbanization happening once the highways are constructed. So you could just leave the city and live in your suburbs. There are many ways that you could restrain what's happening in your neighborhood. I want to say that covenants here are part of this big, part of many of these instruments that are being adopted at around the same period of time. But for the first half of 20th century, they are the primary method of restricting neighborhoods because large-scale zoning adoption doesn't start until the 1940s. And suburbanization doesn't really start until the 50s when the highways are constructed. So the first half of 20th century, you really want to focus on racially restricted covenants. And unlike mortgage discrimination, which is the redlining maps, this is a direct way to say who your neighbor is, rather than through mortgage lending, which is saying who you're going to lend to based on their race or whether the house has a covenant or not. Now, we also get asked, why Minnesota? Well, first of all, it's the first place and the only place that has this data. We would like to study this in other places, and as more data gets collected, hopefully we can. But in many ways, it's also an ideal setting because it has no history of racial zoning. The city is fast developing, so it's a good place to understand. You sort of begin with a clean slate, where it's a good place to understand the role of initial conditions and how covenants had sort of a persistent effect on prices, segregation. What are the mechanisms for this persistence? So let me talk a little bit about why, the numbers I showed you, that the effects are very strong on segregation today, as well as house price differentials. Why would something that was outlawed 70 years ago, why would it matter today? Why would we see any effect today? Well, the effect of covenants on the past outcomes is almost by design, right? It affected segregation in the past because that was by design. It affected a house price differential in the past because developers were charging you a markup for creating an all-white amenity. But why would that happen today? And there are two big channels through which we should think about why there might be persistent effect. One is what we can call a sorting mechanism. You can call it a racism mechanism. You can call it homophily mechanism. What racial covenants do and did in many Midwestern cities and suburbs in the first half of 20th century is they created initial conditions around which they segregated neighborhoods. So they kept people of similar types together. The median resale on these houses is 17.8 years later. So if you're someone who, now that we've removed covenants in 1948, if you're someone who's moving in the 70s or 80s, and you prefer to live with people of your own race, or you don't want to live with minorities, right? You're going to sort along racial lines into these previously covenanted neighborhoods. So covenants of the past then directly have an effect on where people who are going to be moving into the city in the 80s and 90s and 2000s will have an effect if there is a strong homophily bias. The other is that places with covenants had very different amenities than places that did not. So even if you remove covenants, right, these other amenities exist. So Michael talked a little bit about this in the context of highways, which I mentioned here, but what we didn't talk about is they actually changed the shapes of lakes in Minneapolis metro area to put it near the places that had covenants. So they literally dug up holes and moved the lakes and filled up some areas to put them around neighborhoods that had covenants. Schools were of different quality, were provided in different areas. So even if you remove covenants, if there are differences in public amenities, you can see why some of these effects would persist. Now, to be able to, it's important to think about what this channel is and try and disentangle them because it has an important policy implication, right? If a lot of this is coming from just differences in public amenities, that's a relatively easy thing to fix. I mean, we have to worry about gentrification, but it's a relatively easy thing to fix is that you equalize access to public amenities across different neighborhoods. If most of this is coming from sorting and people just choosing to live near people who look like them, that's about preferences, and it's a harder thing to do from a policy point of view. But I want to, have you think about these two mechanisms when we talk about the persistent effects here. So I'm going to show you a slightly different map than what Michael showed you. So here's Hennepin County, and this square here is Minneapolis. I'm not going to show you anything about Ramsey because it's hard enough to put both over the data. It's hard enough to get data together for just one county, let alone adding another. So here are all the new housing that's built in 1910. So this is 1910 to 1990. And blue is all the housing that's built that don't have a covenant, and red are the ones that have a covenant. This is what it looks like in 1920s. So you can see more covenants are being added, but a lot of them are in South Minneapolis, a lot of them in the West, on the suburban side. A larger share of new housing now has covenants in the 30s, and an even larger share in the 1940s. So what do? We first start with the data that Mapping Prejudice has collected and generously provided for everyone to be able to use. So it's a complete census of Hennepin County. One thing one thing Michael didn't mention, which is really important, is they have looked through every single property deed. So there is no error of type 1 or type 2 error, right? There's no scope for it. So you know every place that has a covenant, but you're also sure that every place that they say that there's no covenant, there is no covenant. They've had 5 people look through both of those things. There are about 25,000 covenants that you find in this time period. We know the date and the specific restrictions of this covenant. You take this data that they've put together and you match it with the tax assessor data. First, it helps you map all this data as to figure out where these covenants were and what these houses are. It tells you what, now you can also connect it with the tax assessor value or the sale value. It gives you housing characteristics. Now, I said something about historic house prices, how the price premium for covenants in the past was about 36%. How do I get house prices of the past? Well, we take a random sample of houses and look through the mortgage documents, about 3,000 of these houses, which gives us mortgage terms, from which we infer what would be the house price, right? And the mortgage documents gives us the names of people owning their homes. So then we can match it to the 1940 and 1950 census and figure out, hey, did after 1948, was there actual mixing in the neighborhood? What is the race and ethnicity of the people who are living in this house? We also match this then with neighborhood characteristics and census data going from all the way to 1940 to 1980, 90, 2000, 2010, 2020. And then connected with a bunch of other data on amenities, like the redlining maps, the 1924 zoning map, highways and lakes, and school quality. So I'm not going to, this is not an economist audience, so I'm not going to go into the details of what we actually do to get a causal estimate. I'm going to talk very broadly about this. The analysis here is done at 2 levels. And what is the question we're trying to ask? We're trying to study the causal impact of covenants that were in the past on socioeconomic outcomes in and around Minneapolis today. So the analysis is done at 2 levels. One is at the individual house level, is there a house price differential? And the other is at a neighborhood level, where we're trying to understand neighborhood racial composition and who owns homes. And what is our key variable of interest here? We're basically comparing houses that have covenants versus the ones that don't, and neighborhoods that had majority covenants versus the ones that don't. Now, the obvious problem with this is what economists call an endogeneity concern, right? Covenants are not added randomly over space and time, which means that the correlation that we establish is not necessarily a causal effect, right? There is a chance that the likelihood of covenants could be correlated with something about the neighborhood that we can't observe in our data. And we've shown that, right? Some of these covenants were added, and I'll show you some more evidence, were added in areas that were actually did not have very nice amenities. So what do? We follow this regression discontinuity design and basically compare houses and neighborhoods that were built right before and right after this 1948 ruling, with the understanding, if we compare these houses and neighborhoods in the same area, the ones built before had a positive probability of having covenants, and if they had covenants, they had restricted neighborhoods. The ones built after did not have covenants, and hence could be more mixed race. So a couple of things that come up trying to deal with this. First is that what economists call a relevance condition, that this Supreme Court ruling should be correlated with actually having a covenant. So whether this enforceability actually mattered or not. And I'll show you some evidence of that. And the second is we want to compare similar houses and neighborhoods. So we compare houses and neighborhoods in a census block or a census tract. So we're controlling for similar neighborhood effects. So one of the things that we are able to do with those 3,000 mortgage documents is check who are the people who are actually buying homes after 1948 once these covenants are removed. And I want to highlight here something that Michael brought up. I have another paper where we use this data, and actually we find that what is very similar to his research is Of course, all the racial minorities were discriminated against, but a really large group that was discriminated against were immigrants, all immigrants except for immigrants from Northern and Northwest Europe. So the Swedish example you showed, they're exactly, our data and our results show that they were not discriminated against. But if you're from Italy, if you're from Spain, if you're from anywhere in Africa or Asia or South America, you're discriminated against. So here, when we say the people, the non-discriminated group is racially white Americans who were born in there, but also immigrants from North or Western Europe, right? And you can see that after covenants are made unenforceable, especially other immigrants, right, who are not from North or Western Europe, are able to purchase homes. Okay, I'm not going to go into and show any equations. Let me just talk a little bit about the results here. Now, I know there's a lot of numbers, too many numbers. All I want you to focus here is on, sorry, let me just hide these. All these numbers, I want you to focus on the bold numbers here. And all we're doing here, our dependent variable is percent white, percent black, percent other in a neighborhood. And our independent variable here is percent covenants. So what does this number in 1980 mean for share white? It means that a 1% increase of covenants in your neighborhood increases white population by 0.03%. Now you can see that the effect is actually getting stronger over time for where white people are living between 1980 and 2020. In fact, the effect of covenants is getting stronger. In the 21st century, right, a 1% increase in covenants has almost a 0.2% increase in white population in the 21st century for these last 2 decades that we have the census data available for. You find similar things or sort of a mirror image for Blacks and for Black residents and for other racial minorities, right? So you can see that a 1% increase of covenants in your neighborhood reduces Black population by almost 1%, so 0.8%, right, in 1980. The effect is sort of getting slightly dimmer in the 2000s, but not going away. And similar effect is happening for other racial minorities. One thing I want to highlight here, and I'll come back to this, is in 1940, right? In 1940, if you don't think about the immigrant group, 99% of Hennepin County is white. There are a few Black residents there, and very few in this other category, which is Native Americans, Asians, Hispanic. And their population is increasing over a period of time. And there are no covenants in 1980s and 90s and 2000 and 2010. Like in this time period, there are no covenants. So all these Hispanics and Asians who are moving into Minneapolis metro area, even though there are no covenants, they're going into areas that did not have covenants, right? So who are the people who are discriminated against? Of course, it's just descendants of people who were directly targeted in the first half of 20th century. But other Black and other minority migrants into this Minneapolis metro area, whether they're coming from outside the country or just, from Chicago or somewhere else in the US, right? They're choosing to go into neighborhoods that don't have, that had no covenants. And the white migration is still going into areas that had racially restrictive covenants. You find a similar pattern for home ownership. We don't have home ownership data for 2010, so we're just going to look at what happens from 1980 to 2010. If you increase covenants in your neighborhood by 1%, white home ownership increases by anywhere between 0.1 to 0.35%, right? So it's explaining a lot of the white home ownership. But you can see that, so you don't find any effects for 80s and 90s for Black home ownership because there's not that much Black home ownership. But when they do start buying homes in the 2000 and 2010s, they're buying homes in areas that were not racially restrictive, right? So even now, no covenants, minorities and African Americans are buying homes in areas that did not have a racially restrictive covenant. So again, so who's getting affected? It's affecting the descendants of discriminated minorities who live there, but also all the new migrants into the Minneapolis metro area moving in today. Now, let's think a little bit about house prices too, because we know the effects of segregated neighborhoods on mobility. But if you're trying to, if you're starting from 2020 and you're trying to equalize the racial wealth gap, one of the ways to do that is through housing. And let's see if there are any house price differentials in covenanted versus non-covenanted neighborhoods. So when you apply the same regression discontinuity IV strategy to house prices, I want you to focus on column 3 and 4 right now. I'm comparing houses that have similar housing characteristics that are in the same neighborhood. So they are in the same neighborhood. You can see that, so this is in log points. In terms of assessed value in 2019, a house that had a racially restrictive covenant has a 4.6% higher home value compared to the house that did not. This is comparing very similar houses as measured by housing characteristics and in the same neighborhood. Now let's dig a little bit deeper about this, and I won't talk about the results here, but one of the things that we find, if you plot what the 1940 house value was and what the probability of adding the covenant is, you can see that most of the covenants that were added in the 1940s are actually in this lower middle class neighborhoods, right? That's because covenants were created in this, we're adding this all white amenity in this lower middle class white neighborhoods. Rich neighborhoods didn't need covenants. They had price as a mechanism to keep people of color out. So covenants were essentially added in areas that were treated as buffer zones. People were worried about those neighborhoods transitioning into minority neighborhoods. So they were lower middle class white neighborhoods were adding these covenants because they were fearful of transition. Actually, that's what you see. That's what happened in Milwaukee. After the covenants are made unenforceable in 1948, even though Minneapolis metro area is able to preserve the segregation effects, right? It's more successful in that, and partly because there's good amount of amenities that were added in covenanted areas in Milwaukee, because other public amenities were not added, those neighborhoods did transition. So this was really an instrument for the middle class white Americans for the first half of 20th century to keep their neighborhood the way that they desired it to be. So the last thing I'm going to say here is that we document the persistent causal effects of covenants of the past on present day outcomes. A 1% increase of covenants in your neighborhood reduces minority residents by anywhere between 0.6 to 1%, so almost a 1-to-1 fall, and minority homeowners anywhere between 0.7 to 1%. And covenanted homes today in 2019 have anywhere between 3.6 to 4.6 higher home value compared to the non-covenanted homes, controlling for neighborhood characteristics and housing characteristics. And the couple of things I want you to take away from here is that where people live today, right, that has an effect on how they're going to, on upward mobility, on schooling, and a lot of the new minorities who are moving into this metro area are still moving into non-covenanted neighborhoods. And this is also, because there's a house price differential, this racial house price wealth differences, of course, kept minorities from lower middle class neighborhoods when these covenants were active, but it's very hard to close the racial wealth gap if there's a house price differential even today. So with that said, we're going to move on to the, should we do a Q&A first? Okay, so you want to come up here and we can start with the Q&A in case there's any questions.
I just want to add, by the way, that like it's been great working with Dr. Steve, because every time we think of something, you're like, man, I'd love to do this analysis, but oh my God, we can never possibly do this. Then we talk to Dr. Steve, she's like, oh yeah, my students already did that. It's incredible.
So we're still on Zoom, right? Okay, perfect. Okay, perfect. Didn't want that on either in case. I'm just trying to get, okay, any questions? If not, we can sort of move to the transcription. I just wanted to get this thing up.
Sure.
The reference to the actual property boundaries, like we see that covers pretty much it.
Yeah.
But then what happens when the new property boundaries are different from the old, like, let's say highway goes for neighborhood.
Yeah.
And property one for steps, like.
Sure. So for Zoom, the question is like, with the matching of to modern properties, how do we manage cases where the property boundaries have changed? So there's a couple different scenarios that happen. I think what's working in our favor here is that generally the property was less subdivided in the past than it is today. So it's generally getting divided up into smaller chunks. And so if you look at the physical descriptions for those modern properties, under the hood, they still have that original property designation. So it'll say something like, oh, this is, for example, okay, this is the eastern half of lot 7 in block 2. So if all of lot 7 was covenanted in the past, we can mark that as successful.
Yeah.
So the problem is though that like, well, can we parse that part that says the eastern half? Right, like, so we're still working on that, but and different counties have handled this different ways. Some counties have changed the lot designation, and so there's a new lot designation, and some of them haven't. So that's a hard thing, and I think it does, like, we can't get to 100%. We're never going to get to 100%, but it works for a lot of the property a lot of the time, more so than I would have thought. But I think this is an area we're still developing as to what extent can we parse these physical descriptions into something meaningful. And I know Dr. Sood's students have done more of a spatial joint approach on.
Yeah, so, at least in our data, 85% were able to just merge on addition block lot. The remaining 15%, we did a spatial join. The RA who did it is actually right over here. And what we have to do is take the spatial description of, this fence to this tree, and then put that into a polygon, and then basically match the house to that. And you have to make some assumptions about how close your match has to be. It's really you're able to get 80-90% with a clean thing. It's the remaining 10% that you have some trouble with, and you have to follow different methods.
Some of it we're just not going to get, and like that's where we got to live with that to some extent.
Like, I guess I agree. I think it's giving a little bit of
Yeah, but even that's hard. That's really hard. Yeah.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Do you see the same questions?
No, can you?
How have racial covenants managed to stay codified in leases except that despite its enforcement being deemed illegal/unconstitutional?
Why? So the question is like, why are these still in the property records? I think partly it's because of the way that, at least in the U.S., property ownership works, is that you need the history of the title to determine who owns this land and what is this land anyway, basically. And so like this stuff is sort of lurking in the history of the property. And in the US, there's at least two different kinds of land ownership. One is called abstract, one is called torrens. And they both have different ways of ascertaining both of those questions, like who owns this and what is the land itself. And because of that, you don't ever delete information. Like, and so when you do a title search, you're basically going back to that history and making sure you can verify all that. So these documents are, so one, they're hiding in there, but two, like we said, those covenants run with the land, right? So those, in most cases, they are technically still there. They're just not enforceable. And the course never said you have to get rid of these, partly because it's completely impossible. Like you could never go back and just erase them all.
And the other thing is it comes because US has a title registration system. If you have a deed registration system, as is common in many other countries, you don't need to keep the whole title. That's another reason why US has title insurance is someone can always challenge your ownership. So you need to keep all the records, and that's why these records, covenants including, are part of the history here. Any other? Okay, yeah.
You've got this big wave of immigration and people moving to other parts of Minneapolis. And the existing housing stock is becoming open over. They're moving into new houses, which by definition is going to affect them. Is that not?
It's actually, that's the design, is it's saying that we're only going to look at new housing built between 1945 and 1952, so really close to 1948. And we're exactly relying on the fact that these are just new houses. It's just some of these people who are coming in from the South or other places are moving into houses built between 45 and 48, right? And some of them are moving in 49 to 52. The ones who, because if there was turnover, we couldn't study this, right? This relies on the fact that once people move in, those 45 to 48 houses built and neighborhoods built between 45 and 48 are in a sense locked. Maybe there's 5-10% moving, but they're in terms of race, the racial demographic of those neighborhoods, they're locked. Let's compare what happens to these neighborhoods versus the ones where there was some mixing over a period of time. Let's see what happens to them in the 80s and 90s up until 2020. It's just new housing stock. So yeah, I didn't want to get into too much details, but it's just new housing that is being built in and new neighborhoods built in that time period. Okay, perfect. So should we move on to,
Sure, yeah.
Would people be interested in doing a couple of transcribing sessions? Should we click on this? Or?
Sure, yeah, go there, you go to different places.
Okay.
If you have your laptop, that's fine.
Ooh, okay.
That's bad on my part. I can find it, yeah.
I know.
If you have your laptop, go ahead and pull it out, get signed. I don't know if people can get on the Wi-Fi.
So we're gonna try and do this.
I think that thing is working, so I will. Okay, that's right, that makes sense. Is it down there?
Zoom. Yeah, I think we click here.
Oh, there, thank you. Wait, what just happened there?
I know, I can't see it either.
Okay, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna close that browser. Zoom. Has anyone seen me Zoom? Well, that's fun. Right, IT folks still here?
Yeah,
Yeah.
maybe we have one IT guy here. We'll see
Yeah.
if the transcription works. If not, we apologize to people on Zoom.
I think.
Should we change to this one? Is that gonna change?
We're just having trouble seeing the Zoom session. Yeah. It's a little different. Oh, it may be. Yeah, I don't know. For some reason we cannot. We can't share the screen.
Okay, so if we can't share the screen and we can't see it, is there anything we can do? Can we just walk people through how they would be transcribing? Let's just do that.
Yeah. Okay, so I will. So if you want to transcribe, and we're currently transcribing Milwaukee deeds. I really apologize to the people on virtual. I don't know if there's anything else can do on that. You're gonna do the first thing you need to do is you need to sign up for a Zooniverse account. So you're gonna go to zooniverse.org. And it is really important that you create a login. If you don't log in, we don't keep your results. So I'm going to sign in, but you would click register if you're new. So I'm going to sign in. So go ahead and register for an account if you want to follow along real quick. There's nothing I love more than typing passwords in front of a crowd. Okay, first time, definitely not. In my former life as a journalist, I had actual security concerns, and it's a hard habit to break. So, oh, come on. Zooniverse.org. They'll need to register.
They need to create their own.
Yes. Oh, come on. Okay, now look out.
Wait, I can register. Or do you need to go in?
That's a good idea. Let's register.
Okay. We're having some password troubles here.
And Zooniverse is actually a platform that they actually started in the physical sciences and biology. And so there's tons and tons of projects on here. So you can, even if you don't transcribe racial covenants in the future, although we hope you do, there's like so many wild things you can help with on these crowdsourcing projects. What's that? Yeah, sure. Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
So after you got to your account set up, then we're going to open a new tab. This is going to be a little weird. So I'm going to open a new tab and go to the Mapping Prejudice website. So just Google Mapping Prejudice is usually the easiest thing to do. And just click on the website and then go to the Take Action Volunteer page. Scroll down. And we've got some, I would scroll up a little bit. And we've got instructions here for how to transcribe. And so step 1 is watch our training video. We're not going to do that today, but if you want a refresher later, you can do that. Step 2, register to volunteer. We did that. Then you click on step 3. And then you're going to click on the Mapping Prejudice Zooniverse page. You have to do this through our site because our Zooniverse project is not public. And the reason we do this is because, like I said, we really try to prioritize doing transcription with people in the communities that they live in. And so like if we put these up on sort of the open Zooniverse market, it'll get transcribed like that. I mean, they have thousands of volunteers, but then we wouldn't get that experience of people who live in the communities doing the work. So then once you're on the Mapping Prejudice site, scroll down one, it's where it says get started, and click on Milwaukee County, Wisconsin. We're going to do Milwaukee County. And you can close, we can close this, but you can do this tutorial. So we're each going to see a different document here. I'm going to go through a couple steps. And so, so the first question, is this document handwritten or mostly typed? And pretty obviously, this one's mostly typed. So click that. And if we click handwritten, then like basically we throw that into a separate queue. We're going to deal with those separately. It's really hard for people to read both typewritten and handwritten at the same time. It's very tiring. So the next question is like, is there a covenant here? So let's scan through the document here.
How do I go next? Oh.
And so I don't see an obvious one here. And so here's a little trick I'll show you. Is if you don't see it right away, you can scroll down to the bottom of this document. And again, you're going to have different documents, but like at the one on my screen, there's this little I button. And you click on that, it'll actually tell you what term it flagged. And so this one is a citizen one. Citizen is actually not a very good term. There's a lot of other uses for citizen. So I'm going to suspect that this one probably does not have one. So I'm going to do here, what I'm going to do, I'm going to punt. You shouldn't do this, but I'm just going to reload and then get a different deed. Do I have one here? No, that's probably another citizen. Okay, here we go. So I'm going to do it again. This is mostly typed. Now, do we have a covenant? Does anyone see a racial covenant on our screen? Yeah, we see white race in there, right? So
Well, I would be horrible at this.
you get used to it. Like now, like honestly, now I've done so much that like I can just look at the document and be like, "Yep, that one's got one." Like,
Where is it? Can you point?
It's right here.
I see.
Yeah.
Oh, that's true. White race. Hey, we found a covenant.
Yeah.
Okay, so what do we
So
do?
then we click yes. There's a covenant.
Okay.
Go next. Now it says, please transcribe the entirety of the racial description. This is a short one. Some of them are very long, so we lucked out here. And so we want to get what's essentially a complete sentence. The land shall never be occupied by nor conveyed to any person other than of white race.
Okay.
Then next. Now, okay, so now what kind of geographic information? So now this is going to help us map the covenant. And so the options are one or more lots in a single block, lots located in more than one block, only lengthy property description. Cemetery plots, yes, there are cemetery plot covenants, addition wide covenant petition, something else. So I am going to think that.
Well, we know the block is 4 and lot is 15.
So, but actually what I think is going on here is that this is talking about addition wide agreements. So what we need to do here is like, we're not actually sure if this is the right property information. So I'm going to go down to the bottom of this document and there's these 2 dots here. And these are the 2 pages of the document. And so I'm going to go to the previous page and then read here. So this is like, yeah, there's all kinds of stuff in here. And actually this deed is only covering this property here. So it says lots numbered 9, 10, and 11 in block number 2 in Northway. I don't know this addition, so that's exciting. This is a new addition. But so these are 3 lots in a single block. They're all in block number 2. So I'm going to click one or more lots in a single block. Next. And then what is the lot or tract number? So it's 9, 10, 11. So I'm going to separate those by commas. Whoops. Then enter the block number. What is it? 2. And the addition is Northway. And then who is the seller? Milwaukee has very nice and well-behaved deeds. Their seller is all right here at the top. So it's Northway Realty Company. And it's interesting, you can see here, like this is an example of like the developer is putting this covenant in, right? The developer is the seller. And then the buyer is Chaz J. Kraus. And then up here, they not very progressively have just and W, which means and wife, but they usually spell out the wife's name here, and Emily Kraus. Then what date was the deed executed? Again, Milwaukee is very nice. It's not always so clean. The 5th day of 5 for May, and the year is 1930. Then done. So there, that's that covenant. That one's done. So 4 other people will do that, and then you just keep. You're shown another deed, and you can keep going. And what we really find is people do like 1 or 2 of these, maybe 20, and then some people do like 2,000. Like it's unreal how many people do, how much people will do. So.
Well, we apologize to the people on Zoom that we weren't able to show this part, but I hope there's a link, there's a tutorial on the Mapping Prejudice website where they can learn this. Unless there are more questions, we're gonna end now. Well, thank you so much. Yes.
You mean for Toronto? I mean, the first step is finding out, okay, who owns the property records for this area? And are they digitized? And do those property records have property information that can be linked to a modern property? So, so step 1 is, are the deeds digitized? Step 2 is, can you get them in bulk? And then step 3 is, can you get modern geospatial data that will talk to that, like that has either addition block lot or something similar to that. And I think like we would absolutely love to see more work. I think people need to understand this is a multi-year process that you're signing up for. So that it's important to understand that, but we would love to see more projects come out of it.
And I should say that while Milwaukee hasn't taken, what they're going to be done by the end of the year, for the first place they did was Hennepin County, where Minneapolis is. Took them 5.5 years to put the first map out. So it's a half a decade long project at least. But once you pay the fixed cost for one city in one country, or at least one state, you learn the processes. And I think from 5 years to 4 years, and then 3 years, and hopefully shorter.
I think we are hoping to bring that down in a couple different ways. One is that there is increased familiarity in the U.S. that this is a thing that people are going to ask for, and we now are very fortunate that we have good relationships with the record custodians, who we can then say, we can talk to new jurisdictions and say, here, talk to the recorder in Hennepin County. They'll tell you we're not going to put all your deeds up on the internet. We're not like monsters. And we've also learned a lot of how to do this process. And also the technical process, like I said, it used to take us months to do the first OCR step. Now we can do that in days. But really the hard part is just getting access to the deeds. That's the hard part. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so sometimes the way we do it is we upload the page that has the flag restriction, the language, and then the previous and the next page if they're available. There are definitely times, especially in Milwaukee, where the deed is actually longer than that, and we didn't give you enough information. And so in that case, there's two options. You can click on sort of the need some help with this task button to see if maybe you just haven't found it. And then the other thing is just say like, I can't figure this out. And that's like, and then we will come in on the back end and we can look at the other pages and say, oh, okay, that was actually on 2 pages previous.
Like the one over here, this is the first page with no address. Here's the second page with no address. And here's the third page with no address. So this might be we need a help here.
Yeah, although this one I'm guessing probably doesn't have one. This looks like a will or something like that. And they tend to mention citizen and will, and so that got flagged. We're actually not going to use that term anymore, but we wanted to throw it in because Milwaukee has a particular history of being a very German city. And then in World War I, there's suddenly a lot of pressure to be not German and to be all American. And so we are interested to see if there's citizenship related covenants. That there are some, but citizen occurs so much, it's just not a very useful term. And we've eliminated that from future ones. Also because if citizens in there, it's probably going to hit on one of our other terms as well. So we don't think we're losing stuff by dropping that one.
Okay,
All right.
well, thank you
Thank
for
you.
coming,
Yeah.
and thank you to all the people on Zoom who bore with us in the end when we couldn't really share stuff. I think we can close this room now. Thank you very much. Thanks.
Thanks for sticking it